Okay, hi everyone. Let's take a look at Adobe Illustrator. A quick introduction here. If you've used Photoshop, it's very different. Actually, it looks similar, and there's a lot of similarities, but there are some things which can be a bit confusing if you've used Photoshop before. Basically, this is mostly a vector-based program. Photoshop is mostly a raster-based program, and Photoshop mostly works with little pixels of color. It's a map of little pixels, little squares of color on the screen, for example, a photograph or a fine artwork. And you can go zoom way in on those and you can see the little squares. So it's just a map of little squares of color. And you can erase them, you can turn down the opacity of each little square, you can increase or change the color, or you can do a lot of that all at once. And if you use the Paintbrush tool in Photoshop, you're going to be working with pixels. Same for the eraser tool, and so you can get a lot of very fine artwork with Photoshop. Illustrator, you can also do a lot of incredible artwork with Illustrator, but it's very different. It's mostly vector based, which means vector just means a point, 2 points, join them up with a line. That's it. That's a vector. The point between two lines. So basically it's a direction and a distance is a vector. So a shape in all these programs, actually Photoshop's the same, any kind of shape. I'm just making this with the pen tool, it doesn't matter. Just 4 points there, joined them up, made a little bit of a curve there just for fun, and basically it filled in with the red automatically. You can change the color. I just click on the fill swatch here on the tools panel. It's also got a stroke on it, so I'm just going to switch that stroke off. And so I've moved to the select tool here, the top left, and click on it. There's your stroke. I'll just go to the little red line, diagonal line on a white background. You can see it change down here as well. That means no color. So that's pretty easy, as long as you get used to that pretty quickly in this program. A lot of other programs, little red diagonal line in Adobe programs anyway. So there you have a shape. So it's just a vector shape. So just like Photoshop, you have some options for shapes here. Here's another shape. This is a vector shape. This is the curves are made a little bit differently, but it is basically the same idea of joining points up. It's not quite like that, but you can research that. Actually, Wikipedia actually has a really good explanation. If you look up Bezier curves, Bezier, B-E-Z-I-E-R, curves, that's actually got some nice little animated graphics that show you how all this works. But the basic point is it's just little points joined up. That's all it is, not pixels. So you join up all the points and fill them in with a color. That's it. There are similar things in Photoshop. These shapes work exactly the same in Photoshop. Text is also vector based. It's the same thing, except those files have to be able to spell. They also have to, change the font size, but it's basically the same thing. It's just shapes. That's all it is, really. It's kind of like vector shapes, a lot like vector shapes. So let's see. So that just gives you a very basic idea here of some of the shapes. The paintbrush, for example, let's look at that. Very different. It's really like using the pen tool. If you've used the pen tool in Photoshop and Illustrator, they're exactly the same. So let me just, here's the quick pen tool. If you're in my classes here, we're not using that yet, but just to show you that these two things are actually exactly the same. Join up 2 points. Here's another one. I'll make a curve on that. I'm not going to do a pen tool tutorial here, but it's a bit of practice. Make any shapes you want, and basically that's exactly the same in Adobe Illustrator and Adobe Photoshop. The pencil tool is this paintbrush tool or the pencil tool in Illustrator is nothing like the paintbrush in Photoshop. In Photoshop, you're painting out little pixels. It's kind of magic. You paint across the screen, and you have color, and maybe even a soft edge paintbrush so that the edge of your paint looks softer at the edge of your paint stroke. It's very different here. This is actually a lot like using the pen tool and applying an effect to this. So with the pen tool, this is an old tool, goes back decades, this pen tool. So a person can have a line. I'll just take the color out of that line there. Actually take the color out of the fill, and I'll just put a black line on that. Here's the fill color. I'm going to the little red diagonal. So a little black line, that's all it is. Pen tool, that's made with a pen tool. So it's just a vector pen tool. This is a pen tool that creates vectors, and it makes what's called Bezier curves, like I just mentioned. So it's all just mathematical points joined up and made to look like a curve. That's all it is. And then what's nice about vectors is that computers can recalculate those numbers very, very instantly. And so the complexity of the curve can be rescaled, for example, made bigger instantly and very, very effectively and very smoothly. Whereas pixels, to get pixels to take a photograph, for example, and make it bigger, a lot bigger, you end up, it's almost impossible to make it a lot bigger without losing some quality. Vectors will recalculate how many points you need, and that's the advantage of them, and make it perfect. So that's why text is also vectors. It didn't used to be, by the way. It used to be made of pixels, which was pretty nasty. But now we have vector-based text, so you can type, you can put it on a giant poster, have it printed up perfectly. If you take a tiny little photograph, something small, and try to put that into a huge poster that's going to be printed, it's not going to look good. So that's why vectors are, whenever you can use vectors, you use them whenever you can. So that's the pen tool. We're not going to talk about that too much right now. I just brought the pen tool up to say it's exactly the same as the paintbrush tool. I can't draw that same line there, but let me just try. Whoops, I'm using a pretty bad mouse right here, touchpad actually. So let's see, that's not too bad. And also you can see it sort of straightening itself out. So let's find out what that is. If you double click on any of these tools, you get more information. That's an important point. It's the same in Photoshop for some tools, but it's definitely a main feature of Illustrator. So double click on that brush tool, paintbrush tool. Now you have smoothness options and fidelity, meaning how smooth, it's basically how smooth it is. These are just smoothness options. So we're just going to keep that way down at 0. And you can see now it didn't smooth itself out as nicely as that one did. So let me turn that back up. It's not something a person needs to spend any time on really right now, but it's just to show you how all this works. Now let me do the same thing again. Pretty bad, but it smoothed itself out. So double click if you want to get a smooth, if you know you want to get smooth edges. Now all this is a path with a black stroke or line applied to it. And you can apply effects to this as well, which we're not going to get into. But the point is, it's just the same as doing something with the pen tool, which I did way back here. And I'll do one more of those, this pen tool, to show you that you can make beautiful sine waves or whatever you want to do using the pen tool. But I'll do another video describing how to use the pen tool in more detail later. But basically, they're the same. This is a path. They're both paths, and they have a black stroke applied to it. This stroke is thinner. The other one I think is maybe 9 point or something. So they're exactly the same. So the little stroke just means line or outline in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, stroke would mean something like an outline to an object. In this case, it's just an effect. If you look into the brushes now, let me find the brushes panel here under window, and I'll pull it right out of here. And as you apply any of these effects, these are little effects that are in the brushes panel, and there's a whole bunch more of them in all the panels, in most of this software. On the top right, you're going to see some more options, this little drop down menu, and here we'll just go for open brush library, and then you'll see another little one. You can't quite see it in the video here. Another little drop down, and I'll go to what, artistic, and then there's another little one there. Let's just go pull this up. There it is. So I just applied that brush to that stroke I actually made, that path I made with the pen. So that's made with the pen tool. This one was made with the paintbrush, same thing, right? So this is all just little vector lines. So the paintbrush tool is nothing like it is in Photoshop. Let's quickly look here, a couple other things, and then we'll look at the layers panel. This is the eraser tool. Let's look at that. It's not going to work the same as it is in Photoshop. So I just double clicked on it to see some of the options here. We'll bring it up a bit bigger, size here, click OK. So let's see. Now you want to select with any of this in Illustrator, you have to select the object. You also have to be careful that when you have an object selected, you don't accidentally click on something else that you don't want. So you have to make sure it's selected. You also have to be a bit careful making sure it's not selected. Here, let's try this little eraser tool. It just cuts it. That's all it's doing. And depending on how many little anchor points, you can barely see them there. I'll zoom in a little bit. You can see them there, little anchor points. There's one, there's another one, there's another one right here. So it's just going to erase part of the line and put in another anchor point or two. So I'm just eating this away. Let me go back up to here. Remember, this was made with the paintbrush tool originally, and it just cuts it, and it cuts bits of it off. Now these are different objects. They're separate, so you can move them around separately. It's nothing like Photoshop. Even on this fake charcoal effect, remember, this is just an effect that's applied to a path. Okay, so it's not pixels, no pixels in this. There might be some of these have some raster aspects applied over the top, but it's not really going to be something that you're going to be dealing with here. So let's make sure I select this one. There it is. You can see it selected. Try the eraser tool, cut away at it. And you can see it jumps a little bit and redesigns it because it's not pixels, it's an effect. So it has to go, instead of going from one end of the line that I created, from one end way over here on the left to the other end, instead of going applying this effect all the way along there, now I chop it, and it has to apply the similar kind of effect. Remember, it's a special effect from one end to the other of each of those. So it changes it, and that's something that you have to deal with and get used to. It's not that easy. In fact, erasing anything in this program can become, you have to be careful basically. You just have to, it's not something that, you have to basically, you want to build all your paths first if you can. And if you get into erasing, you're just going to have to get used to the idea that there's going to be changes. I could apply some more complex effects to this and show you that in more detail, but I think that gives you the idea. So that's the paintbrush, eraser, pencil tool, similar, almost the same. These other tools I think are basically all the same, very similar. Rotation tool, you can rotate something, big deal. Scale tool, you can scale something, or is that the scale tool I got there? Yeah, scale tool. You should be able to scale things up a bit. Doesn't work well with this, but other shapes you'll see how that works, and a lot of other objects. There's a lot more to this, very fascinating and fun tools here. I won't get into too much of those. Those are the main ones to look at right now if you're new to this. Paintbrush, eraser, very strange if you've been in Photoshop, but I think you get the idea there. And then some of these shapes, basically here's a rectangle shape. This is identical in Photoshop and Illustrator, these kind of things. There's vector shapes. I'm going to click on the fill color, add a color. Let's use the eraser on that now, see what happens. It cuts it into two different pieces. You've got to click away sometimes. Oftentimes it's just easier to just click away from things that are completely selected. So when I erased right through there, I'm now on the selection tool. It's still all one piece as I try to move it around. So I click away because I just want to get this piece and move that. Right. So want to change the color on that. I always just go to the color picker. I'm just more used to it, but some people will probably end up going up here, there's all sorts of ways to find different color swatches and gradients over here. So that gives you some basic ideas there. Let's see, there are some other ways to snip things, which we'll talk about, cutting things or erasing parts of things, but I think with that you can do quite a lot. So that gives you a fairly good idea of the beginning of this, just getting used to it. It's very different, it's not that easy to work with in some ways, I think, compared to Photoshop. Well, not that it's not easy, it's actually very easy to work with. It's just very different if you're used to Photoshop and you're not used to using this. In fact, I go back and forth between these. Sometimes I haven't used this one for months, so it takes me a couple of minutes to get back into it. But you get the idea here. Let's see, so that would be some of the tools. I'm not sure what else would be important. Oh yeah, the magic wand. Ignore that. We'll talk about that some other time, but it's nothing like the magic wand in Adobe Photoshop. It basically picks up vector shapes of similar color. It's nothing like it, so we'll talk about that some other time. Not sure, there's not a lot else to say. Let's look at the crop tool real quickly here. It's not called the crop tool, it's called the artboard tool, which means these are artboards. You can adjust your artboard anytime you like. Click on the artboard tool to do that. I won't get into too much to that, but you can also make new artboards by clicking on this little icon way up in the top here. You can barely see it in the video probably, but it's right up here when you have the artboard tool selected. Hover over it to see the word new artboard. Click on that and you get an identical artboard. You can adjust it to be a different shape if you want to. So this allows you to do all sorts of parts of a project. You might have an illustration going on for a website. You might have a banner. Maybe you have some logo going on at the same time. And all sorts of other possible projects could be worked on many different artboards like this. So these are the artboards. That's your artboard tool. When you save this work, remember you're always saving it every couple of minutes. Save it, which I haven't done yet, and then save it, and then save every couple of minutes as an Illustrator document. If you're in one of my classes and you're watching this, let's have you say we're going to use this method. We could use save for web. If you've used that and a lot, you could, but it's confuse a lot of people in the beginning. And there's also some issues with it which may not work for our class. So let's go to File, Save As, and we will look for JPEG in this case. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to, yeah, so here's another difference. Adobe Illustrator, you save it as the Adobe Illustrator file, and then you're going to, actually in Illustrator and some other programs, you're going to go to File, Export. So that's another little difference from Photoshop. In Photoshop, you can just go to File, Save As, and you could use PNG or JPEG. I'd rather you guys use JPEG, because if you get into something which has transparency to it, and you save it, and maybe it's a beautiful artwork that something you draw, you might end up with a. It's possible, especially if we're using Photoshop, and even in here, you might end up with a grey background, which is not really part of your design, and it can mess your design up. But in this program, it won't matter as much. So yeah, JPEG or PNG. I just when I'm teaching Photoshop, I prefer people to use JPEG in the beginning, because what's nice about PNG, quickly, same as very similar to JPEG. Some file size, smaller file size in some cases, but the most important thing is you can have a transparent shape, or a transparent background rather, which is a great advantage. But it can also mess up our especially our Photoshop designs if we start using that. So I prefer people to stay away from that in the beginning. But let's say you had a round logo and you wanted that to go over a photograph on a banner, on a website, or on a print, then you can save it with a transparent background. That's what's nice about these. So yeah, we won't get into that too much here, but yeah, just stick to JPEG to be safe. Yeah, you can use PNG as well if you want to. It doesn't make that much difference. JPEG used properly is a highly advanced file and can be seen worldwide, and so can PNGs. Any computer in the world can see PNGs or JPEGs, and certainly JPEGs for sure. Um, and in terms of quality, they are just as good quality. Sometimes, depending how you save it and depending how you treat it, PNG will be a smaller file size, and that's an advantage. But other than that, for us, it's really not that big a deal. Not something to, you know, get too excited about. Either one is good. JPEG, I know for sure we won't get those funny grey backgrounds that sometimes, especially if we're using Photoshop, can end up in student projects, and it kind of spoils them because you weren't expecting it to look like that. So anyway, that's just some small points there. Gives some overview of Illustrator and some file information. Last thing I want to look at here, let's look at the layers panel. So that's the other thing that can confuse people. Layers panel. Bring that right out here. Here it is. Look at that. I made all those different objects on this page. What did I have? I had a circle or a moon shape over there or something. And there's only one layer. That's weird, isn't it? That's not like Photoshop, but it's just a little drop down here, and they're all there. There's that moon shape. There's that pink shape. So basically, they're all there. And it's in this program, all you have to do is think about this as here's all your layers. They're called sub-layers here, but they're just little layers, and basically they're just layers that are grouped in a folder. If this was Photoshop, this would be just like grouping these little layers in a folder, except Illustrator does it first and calls it a layer. Confusing, isn't it? So basically, in Photoshop, you might make some layers and then put them in a little folder called a group, and here it just puts them all on one layer ahead of time. And you know what? You notice I didn't make any new layers. You know, the only reason I tend to make new layers is if something gets real finicky, or I really need to keep things separate, especially just for these projects that we're doing in the classes. Generally, you almost never have to make new layers. You can practice that. It's good practice. But sometimes something gets really finicky, or you really want to keep something separate. You can make a new layer for that. You know, especially if you're doing a complex illustration or something, give it a new name. I don't know, maybe it's got parts of something in it, and you can put everything on that layer. So then you know where everything is for that particular element that you're building up. So that's basically all you have to do. But other than that, you really don't have to think about that too much right now. So again, it's just a little drop down with different layers on it. I wouldn't bother getting into making new layers at all until you're really used to this. There's no reason to at the moment. So I'll just trash that in the little trash can. There's my layers. There it is. So that's how it works in terms of text. We'll talk a lot more about text later. But as you notice, I will just put some text up here because there's one other thing I wanted to mention, and that is the area outside your artboards in Adobe Illustrator is like a scratch area, or a scratch paper where you just scrap paper where you just keep things. It's like having a desk. Imagine this is like a desk, and you're keeping parts of some project out here on the desk like they used to in the old days. So but in terms of text, we'll talk more about that. It's pretty, there's so much to say about text, we don't want to get too much into that here, but basically you're going to have new layers, a bit like Photoshop. There it is, there's the layer. And yes, it's a lot like Photoshop and other programs. You're going to select it, change the color. Fonts, let's see, your fonts here, you got some options here if you double click on the tool. And you will see some options up top as well, like most tools. So in the beginning, you can't quite see them on the screen here, but you'll see just the general font options, pretty easy. And we'll talk a little bit more about things like the character panel, which you might have seen me bring up there to adjust the size, and maybe it's got a lot of the same things, but there's a lot more to the character panel that we will look at later. So that gives you some overview. Hopefully that gets you going. Remember, it's just like Photoshop. You can pull these objects, up and below, above and below each other. Click, drag, drop, same thing. Not sure what else to say. I think just remember that when you're using these shapes, and if you start to try to create something that maybe you're going to use the eraser, for example, then you're getting into something that's very different in Photoshop, and it is a little bit unpredictable at times how the eraser works. But you'll get used to it, and it's actually what they've done in Illustrator. Eraser is maybe a couple of versions that they brought that in. It's not that old. Well, it certainly wasn't as good as this if it was, and it's actually become really good. So you can eat away at things. This is a nice tool. You know, oftentimes there were ways. There's always been ways to do this in Illustrator. It's a bit more laborious, but if you get good at this, this could be really. This is a nice little tool. This eraser, if you're real careful. But there are other ways to get more accuracy. You see, I'm not quite getting that there. It's not quite the same. But you know, it's just a nice thing to play around with, and quite good, really. So again, anything you want to change, a lot of things you want to change, you just click on the tool. So just trying to change the size there. Actually, let's change the size. There's a lot more to this as well I could talk about, so we'll leave it there. And main thing is, if you practice some of this, it's going to be easy for you. Okay, hope this helps. Bye for now.